Season 4 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Daniel Murphy, Polar Inertia, a journal of nomadic and popular culture, online at polarinertia.com, and by Press Up, friendly web consultants who listen to your goals and provide solutions that make sense, online at pressupinc.com. Are there any stylistic choices you see on the street that indicate to you you're in Toronto, not Montreal, not Vancouver, no other Canadian city, distinctively Torontonian styles?
No, sadly there aren't. What Toronto, and particularly the districts that I tend to live and move in, look exactly like what the media would call hipster districts anywhere else in the white world. So the boys have beards and tattoos and heavy horn rimmed glasses, and the girls wear vintage or secondhand dresses and running shoes, just like any other educated middle class white district of anywhere else in the world. Toronto is known as a less stylish city than Montreal. Certainly the women of Montreal have a reputation for being the most beautiful because they're French in Canada. And Toronto has a reputation for being a very boring city stylistically, very conservative. If you go to the economic hub, the financial district, certainly you'll see men in gray suits, and those suits are becoming a little narrower. But you'll still see that female look that we associate from the 1980s and the use of the word yuppie, which nobody uses anymore, where you see...
Still current here?
No, it isn't. But the look is, you'll see women coming home from work in their business suits, wearing running shoes, carrying their shoes in a bag. That's still a very Toronto look.
Running shoes on the way home. Yes.
Yeah.
So it's whatever style it has. It has its particular style, Toronto, good or bad, which is where we're sitting today, by the way, on Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, speaking today with Russell Smith. He is a novelist. He's the author of books like How Insensitive, Noise, Muriella Pent, and Girl Crazy. He's also the author of Style and Culture columns in the Globe and Mail. He has a men's style book called appropriately enough, Men's Style, A Thinking Man's Guide to Dress. And most recently, he put out an ebook called Blindsided, How 20 Years of Writing About Booze, Drugs, and Sex Came to an End in the Blink of an Eye. Tell me, by the way, what circumstances led to you writing that essay about your retinal detachment?
I've never published memoir before. I'm kind of opposed to it. I've always thought of myself as a strict fiction or journalism guy. And I had this series of adverse events. I lost the sight in one eye due to a retinal detachment just after my son had been born, just after my father had died, just as my partner was relapsing into terrible alcoholism. My life was in terrible crisis. And a magazine, Toronto Life magazine, the big city magazine here, came to me and said, well, you write about it. And they offered me a bunch of money. I mean, why does anyone ever write about anything if not for money? I was embarrassed.
Samuel Johnson said.
Exactly.
What's the word?
No one but a blockhead would write but for money.
I think you'd have the quote.
So I just couldn't turn down the money, and I had to bare my soul, and it turned out to be one of the most popular things I'd ever written. People like stories of trauma, I guess.
Right. You've gone on record as being very much pro ebook, very much pro what the internet can do with books, cheaper, shorter, more accessible. Was this in your mind as you wrote this? Like, great, this can be an ebook, this can be short, this can be easily accessible, everything like that?
No, it was my agent who came up with that. I mean, I'm just thinking in an old-fashioned way, big glossy city magazine wants to publish it, they'll pay me. Right. Then the editor said, we must retain electronic rights. Right. This is a new thing that people are thinking about when selling works to magazines, and they should be thinking about it more. Don't sell the magazine the electronic rights. Get paid less by the magazine, and yourself publish it as a single one-off ebook. This book is available for $2.99, so Canadian. So very inexpensive to write a long magazine article. It's evidence of a devolution of power, of publishing power. And the responsibility to self-promote moving more and more to writers themselves, and not to gatekeepers or power brokers.
And that that's not, some writers think that's the worst thing in the world. You don't seem to.
There are certain downsides to it. I mean, we're certainly not trained to be self-promoters. I'm not. I did a very bad job of promoting that. And I simply don't have the time to be manipulating social media all the time. And I also don't want to be building up a persona that I am selling, particularly when I'm writing fiction. I want myself to be invisible when I'm writing fiction. So it's really troubling to a lot of writers, and for good reason.
Now, for those first two novels I mentioned, How Insensitive and Noise, you seem to get branded by readers, by publishers, who knows, as the novelist of young urban Toronto. Was that in any sense a desire for you, or did it happen to be your milieu and that's what you were writing?
Well, both, but it definitely was a desire for me. I mean, when I was in university in the 1980s, I had the rage of all young people, and I'm very much of the classic Generation X. I had the rage of all of my contemporaries that our lives were not being represented in the literature of our country. Our literature was famously rural, famously focused on the past, famously sad, and not funny, and
like can-lit tropes.
This is what we call can-lit, yeah, and everybody in positions of power in publishing were of the baby boomer generation, and nobody was reflecting an urban life where people were living together in shared houses, which all my contemporaries were doing, and where our cultural reality was international. It wasn't local. I mean, I certainly didn't think of myself as a Canadian writer. The writers I was reading at the time were English writers, speaking English language writers from the United States, from the UK. I was reading Jay McInerney, and then later Martin Amis, and certainly my literary influences weren't Canadian at all. And so I wanted, and also I was interested in satire. I was also interested in humor, which I wasn't seeing anywhere in Canadian literature. And so yes, I came out swinging a bit. I came out with a sense that I was righting wrongs, I guess. I think young writers often start off feeling that they're writing against something. I think I very much moved away from that now.
It's interesting that, I mean, there's this, you describe the certain provincialism of traditional canlit, and then Toronto, you look at Toronto, and it's almost the quintessence of an international city. I mean, the word multiculturalism has been bandied around about Toronto for decades, but was the sheer internationalism of this place something you sensed when you first came here from Halifax, where you grew up?
Yes, definitely it was, and it's always been thrilling. I mean, it's the part of Toronto that's absolutely electrifying. When I remember, I went to university at Queen's, which is in Kingston, Ontario, a small town between Montreal and Toronto. We always used to in the 80s, we were looking for punk rock. That's the music we wanted to hear, and we would go for weekends to Montreal or weekends to Toronto. And Toronto gradually became the dominant scene, just being bigger. And so I remember the excitement of coming to Toronto on weekends and arriving in Chinatown. And the excitement for me was to get off in the middle of crowded, bustling, stinky, sweaty Chinatown with the cries of the food sellers all around, and have a meal of food that was something very unusual to me, and then go to see a punk rock concert. It was the very definition of urban sophistication and cosmopolitanism to me. And I love the fact that I can walk down the street in Toronto and hear 7 languages in 2 blocks. My son I have a 5-year-old son, who is going to a public school in this neighborhood, which is really a United Nations Council. There are literally children from every country in the world there. Almost every language you could imagine is represented within a few square blocks. I can't imagine growing up with that, how different his outlook toward the world will be from mine growing up in a homogeneous environment.
And this neighborhood here is Bloordale, where it's international like Toronto is, but it's also, like a lot of Toronto is, it seems to be rapidly coming up in the world in terms of not 20 years ago, not an area you'd want to have lived in, right?
Definitely. We're close to the intersection of Bloor and Lansdowne, which was a notorious intersection for crack dealing in the 1990s. And there was visible prostitution and crime. And of course, because that meant that real estate values were lower, now creative people like me have moved in, bought real estate in the neighborhood, and is changing rapidly. And now many of the abandoned storefronts along Bloor Street have become coffee shops and art galleries. And so it's one of those, again, very, very typical hipster neighborhoods now.
I wonder, this is what they call gentrification, yeah. I suppose, but are there any people here in Toronto who, you know the type, the ones in New York who pretended to love it in the 70s, but who, if you really get down to it, they would admit that they were not that happy with the guy shooting up next to them on the graffiti-filled subway, right? Are there people who long for the crack dealing days? Yeah.
Well, yes, there are, and for good reason. Like, for example, I name one particular artist who's made quite a campaign out of it. His name is István Kantor. He's a Hungarian-Canadian. He's lived here since the 70s, and he is a very well-respected conceptual and performance artist. He lives in this neighborhood, and he is a winner of the Governor General's Award, the most prestigious art award in this country. And he is an artist who, part of his art is to attack other art. Recently, he sprayed his own blood at a Jeff Koons in the Whitney and was arrested. We reward these artists in Canada. and he is very fiercely anti-gentrification, as many artists are, because simply for economic reasons, that there are many industrial buildings and warehouses around here that artists have always had access to for their studio space, and increasingly they're being torn down or turned into condos, and we simply can't afford it anymore. And that means a much less colorful neighborhood, a much less creative neighborhood, and his hatred of gentrification is bordering on the violent, and these resentments are really real and for good reason and understandable, and yeah, he would come out and say, yes, I preferred the heroin in the alley to the organic vegan food store.
He liked it because it was more affordable. Did he love the heroin? I mean,
well, who knows what's opposed in that statement? He would say, yes, I love the heroin, but that's part of his art to say that. I don't. Obviously, as I said, I have a small child growing up here, so and now, of course, I own real estate, so now, of course, it's in my interest to have the real estate value.
You want it to be more gentrified because it's more money in your pocket, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. Although, this cafe we're sitting in has a very Portuguese flavor. If you come here on a Friday night, you're not going to hear English spoken at all. And I certainly don't want the hipsters moving in here, and I certainly don't want to lose the Portuguese bakery across the street with genuine Portuguese pastries, yeah, I certainly, and all of that kind of ethnic color in Toronto will eventually be effaced by rising real estate values, and that is sad.
It makes sense to think of it in those terms. I mean, we have the same situation in Los Angeles where it's different immigrant groups, but seemingly as diverse, and you do get, as you say, the hipsters, they find their way to certain neighborhoods, and then there's a lot of complaint in the media or just in conversations about that. But I wonder, I mean, given that based on the history of cities, gentrification seems inevitable, this just sort of neighborhoods gentrify and then crumble again and then gentrify again. I mean, tell me, since you've been in Toronto these decades, have you always had to kind of stay on the frontier, move around to the frontier of gentrification?
I've done literally that. I mean, when I first moved here in 1989, the area around the University of Toronto had been, right through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, a student-y district. It's called the Annex. And it's a beautiful area of narrow brick Victorian houses. It's very leafy. It's very Anglo-Saxon looking. And I lived there. I lived in an apartment above a store on the main street. After a couple of years, I had to find a better situation. There were no affordable housing. We moved to the edge of the Annex. Then I moved down to an area called College Street, which was Italian. It was a Little Italy. And there were cafes filled with old Italian men drinking red wine out of tumblers then. And very, very rapidly in the 1990s, became more than gentrified. It became actually chic. The house that I was sharing with my friends would now be worth well over $1 million. I moved then to Parkdale, which is still a rough but well-known artistic area. And so, yes, I've constantly, every time I've moved further away from the center. I've always, and for a while I resented that, but now I see that wherever I go, the money's going to follow, so it doesn't really matter.
You yourself are an indicator of that. If Russell Smith moves to a neighborhood, it's going to get more expensive.
They talk about the Starbucks effect, right? They say that if there's a Starbucks in your neighborhood, the real estate is worth, a house is worth $50,000 more. There is no Starbucks in this neighborhood, not even within miles of this neighborhood. No, so we'll know that things have really changed when there's a Starbucks.
There seems to be Starbucks equivalents here. What's the one that's around everywhere? Second cup? Does that have the same price effect? If there's a second cup,
No, not quite. Starbucks is known to be chicer. I don't know why.
International. I don't know. But in any case, I came to your fiction through your writing about men's style. Mm-hmm. When you began writing, did you foresee any of that part of your career, the men's style writing, or indeed the writing on culture, the sort of writing from your own perspective?
No, absolutely not. I studied literature. My dad was an English prof, and I went and studied languages in university. I ended up studying French literature, and I did an MA in French literature, feminist approaches to surrealist poetry. I thought I was going to do a PhD. I thought I was going to be
deep in it.
I thought I was going to be an academic, and then I was a bit daunted by going on and doing the PhD, mostly because of the theory that was necessary to read at the time. And I thought I'd come to Toronto and take a break. And that's when I got caught up in I knew a guy from Queens who had gone to a private school in Ontario, and he started taking me out with rich young people in Toronto. And that's when they showed me nightclubs, they showed me magazine launches, they showed me fashion. And I had no idea I was going to be writing about any of that. But I'd written an article for a magazine about South Africa, which is where my family's from, about white life in South Africa. And it was a small general interest, sort of intellectual magazine. And I went down to a meeting with them. And they were all middle-aged, tweedy guys with English accents. And they English or Eastern European accents. And they said to me, so we liked your article, we want to publish it. Do you know anything about fashion? And I said, why, sure, of course. And they said, good, you'll be our fashion correspondent. And it was only because they didn't know any other young people.
He must know. He's younger than us.
Exactly. And so I started writing for this small intellectual magazine called The Idler about going to nightclubs. And then I thought I could write. I was fish out of water. I was from a small town, and I thought it was very amusing, the language and the blasé behavior of the rich kids that I was hanging around with. And I had always loved Yves Lenoir and Kingsley Amis and P.G. Wodehouse and other British satirical writers. And my friend said, you should write about the scenes that you're describing, as if you were Waugh. And so I started working on a novel in the early 90s, and simultaneously with this new stream of income that was falling into my lap, which was just kind of being a professional nightlife goer. And I did a lot of writing like that for Toronto Life magazine.
How much of this could you expense?
None. I had no expense account, but I never paid for a thing. I once I was in the right circles, we would go to launch parties, dine on canapes and free drinks, and
that's all free.
And then somebody else late at night would give you a line of cocaine, and you'd be you'd off to the races. You wouldn't need to eat too much. And then, I was living on very little at the time. I was living in a shared house with 3 or 4 people and paying in a tiny attic room, with a single bed and a desk where I did my writing. And it was a great time of great freedom. I had no responsibilities. I didn't have a job. It was fantastic. And then, of course, I wrote my fiction, my first couple of books about that scene as well. Style I had no knowledge of, no formal knowledge of.
So when you said you knew what fashion was, you were just like, I'll learn this on the job.
Absolutely. And I became a restaurant critic too, with no knowledge of food at all. I was a terrible restaurant critic. I was far more interested in what people were wearing than what they were eating.
Well, it's all part of the experience. You can't focus. It's like a restaurant critic I tend to find that a restaurant critic fails when they're too narrowly focused on only the food. It needs to be more holistic, shall we say. And a men's style writer, when all they know is, when they get so inside on the specific fabric and the origin of it. I mean, I have a much higher tolerance for that than most. And even I'm like, if you can't connect this to the wider culture, it's not really useful. In your style writing, were you from day one writing about style, tapping into literature or the life you were living, or even, the nature of cities? It's all kind of there in your writing about clothes.
Right, yeah, I definitely set out to have a sociological approach rather than just a trend report. I find trend reports terribly boring, as anybody literary does. Obviously the fashions are going to change every season. Sometimes lapels are going to be wider. That's just so predictable and so boring. So my idea was always to try to explain it in historical terms, try to explain it in sociological terms, and as you say, try to make literary parallels to say, which writers have always been obsessed with these changes. That's the real joy to me, is to try to see it as part of a larger aesthetic continuum, rather than just tell people. I think many fashion writers get bound up too in the industry questions, in the question, and it becomes more business writing than anything. Which house has bought McQueen, which house has hired Galliano, what merger has occurred. That is of no interest to most people who are interested in what color coat they should buy.
Right, exactly. Or even more so, it seems like your readers have an interest in what they should not do. Like the mistakes that people seem to have an insatiable appetite for your columns on things men do wrong, dressing, what to avoid, the faux pas you shouldn't make. Is that true?
Yeah, they are. And in men's fashion, men's fashion is very different from women's in that the actual runway fashions are farther away from everyday fashions than they are in women's wear. So in women's runway fashion, you can see outrageous costumes on the runway. They will filter down in some modified form in a few weeks to the big chain stores. In men's fashion, that doesn't happen at all. There's still a fantasy world of men wearing rubber skirts or whatever in Fashion Week on the runway, and we still have to wear charcoal suits and leather shoes to work every day. Right. And men's fashion is far more bound by convention than women's is. So in menswear, there are class-bound and exclusionary rules to determine who's a gentleman and who isn't, that are just shibboleths to exclude people. Women's doesn't have that. So in menswear, convention and fashion are actually at odds. Fashion is democratic, open-minded, and convention is hidebound and class-bound, and doesn't want to change at all. Convention wants to say there is a certain way to lace your shoes. If you don't do it that way, you're not a gentleman. And
usually military derived.
Yeah, and British derived too. All over the world, the British have had the greatest influence on those conventions by far. And it's no coincidence that class structure still exists stronger there than anywhere else. But that's the kind of thing I love to write about in men's fashion is those conventions, and they're playing against fashion, and that tension that we're all dealing with all the time between convention and fashion.
Do you see the internationalism of Toronto affecting the styles on the street at all? Is there some, I don't want to say dilution of the British influence because there's such a British past here, but what do you see? What does the multiculturalism make of the fashion here?
Yeah, it does make it much more free and open. It's true. There is multicultural influence, and when we saw that really from the 1970s on, where there was a big Italian immigrant population. Canadian menswear had been very strictly British defined, very heavy British fabrics, heavy suits, and the Italian clothing revolution of the 1960s influenced Toronto far more than it did London because of the Italian population here. And so we were wearing lighter and more drapey suits far before the Brits were. Yeah, because actually we had a population of tailors that that is now a treasure that's frittering away because they're getting too old and their sons have gone on to be lawyers and doctors.
Right. They don't want to keep in the trade. I mean, you write about this in the Men's Style book, where and this is a process I've noticed firsthand, is that who the tailors are changes nationalities as you go. Now it's Asia. I live in Koreatown in Los Angeles, so last I got a suit made, it was with a Korean tailor, and they're really good. They're getting on in years too, though. So I'm wondering, who's coming next?
No, we don't know. I mean, Pakistan is coming up very importantly here, and there's a big Pakistani population here. But again, they don't want. They're the children who've come here of immigrants don't want to be tailors. I mean, it's a very hot and uncomfortable and demanding and badly paid job.
It's rough, but I wonder if it'll seem appealing once again. There's so much talk about the quote-unquote good jobs going away. Maybe tailoring won't look so bad in 10 years.
And there's much more demand now for tailored suits than there ever was. The city becomes more sophisticated. But the waves of tailors were first Jewish. So from 1900 to the Second World War, Eastern European Jewish immigration dominated the garment district, as it did similar garment districts all over the world, and that's where all the tailors came from. And then it became Italians in the 1950s and 60s, and now it's Asian. It's Hong Kong and Vietnam, but there's just not enough of them. I mean, any trained tailor can be guaranteed a job for a quite high-end men's store right now.
It's a golden opportunity for any tailors in other countries who seek to come to Canada. This is the golden opportunity. It's interesting you mentioned the rise in demand for tailored suits, because that rise was already occurring as I came into adulthood. But I guess in the Toronto you came to in the late 80s, was anybody getting suits made?
No, there was very little of that. I mean, that would have been a very elite thing for the wealthy and for the Scottish lawyers who ran the banking industry downtown. That would have happened.
So finance only kind of
thing. Finance only, and there still is a real tension between the idea of getting a made-to-measure suit and fashion here, because the tailors are still the top of them are still old Italian guys who are not very interested in fashion, and it's very difficult to get you a really mod suit, and so often young men come to me and say, what would you recommend? And I would say, if you want something really up to date, it's changing, but it's very difficult to get a tailor who can do that here.
But if you pay custom tailoring prices for a very up-to-date suit, how much are you going to get a decade out of that? Well, probably not.
I mean, that's a lot of guys say, well, I want a classic suit that's never going to go out of style. Sadly, that's kind of turning into a unicorn, that thing. It's kind of mythical, the classic suit that's never gone out of style. Men's fashion is changing now in cycles more accelerated than they ever have been before. It's almost like women's fashion now. And so, it used to be a slight change in the cut of a suit. A change in jacket length would take place over 10 or 15 years, and now it's happening over 5 years. And so it's not really worth your while to get the nattiest suit you can and pay $3,000 for it. I mean,
right.
Because in 5 years you might want another one.
That's true. You can do better or worse for timelessness, but you'll never be exactly in the moment with a perfectly made suit, nor will you ever be eternally viable in one suit either. There's that spectrum, and you're going to be somewhere in the middle.
Right, and there's no, your dad always says to you, well, I just buy a classic suit that's never going to go out of style. Well, that just doesn't exist, and those who say they do not follow fashion are merely in the grip of an older fashion, right? But that's why, actually really expensive designer suits, a Prada suit, for example, is notoriously badly made. These are factory-made suits.
They don't need to be good.
They don't need to be good. They've got fusibles in them. They're machine-made, and they don't have anything like the quality of a tailor-made suit, because exactly, you're going to be buying another one in 5 years.
Right. Tell me, how closely does the Toronto of today, of 2014, resemble the Toronto you wrote about in the sort of How Insensitive days in the mid-90s?
Yeah, it's very interesting. There have been a great deal of changes. And it was a much more bohemian city then because it was more affordable to live downtown. So you could, artists like me could live on Queen Street, the famous kind of cultural strip of this city. You could live in the annex, the student area around the university. And students no longer live there. The houses are worth $2 and $3 million now, and the rents, such that there are, would match that. So there aren't student quarters anymore the way there once were, and it's more multicultural for sure than it used to be, and there is this new high end of glamour that is astounding to me. So there are now wealthy bars and restaurants, particularly hotels, boutique hotels. There's been a wave in the last 10 years of boutique hotels being built with extremely expensive and flashy bars and restaurants, with Lamborghinis and Maseratis pulled up outside that are packed every night, and they are exclusive. You need to be on a guest list to get in. The people in them are not WASPs at all. They're largely not white. They are from all over the world. They're young people in there, not that young. They're in their 30s. And they're in their 20s and 30s. The women look like the cover of Maxim magazine. They are in tiny dresses and heels. They have huge hair. The men are in velvet jackets and John Lobb shoes, and they are, basically burning $100 bills in there. And where that international money is, they are from Iran, they are from Lebanon, they are from all over the world. What kinds of industry supporting that? I'm not really sure. It's new industries, new services. It's the tech industry. It's advertising. It's all of which are centered for this country in this city. It's finance. And it's not artsy, it's not bohemian in the least. As a response to that, private clubs, members-only clubs, are sprouting up in this city that are different. And there used to be in the 1950s onwards, or well, really since the 1920s, there have been old-style British clubs in this city, usually associated with a particular political party, and they are exactly what you picture a gentleman's club to look like. They have leather-bound chairs and libraries and businessmen go there, and those clubs had names like the Albany Club, the National Club, the York Club. They're still going, and they still service the financial elite. Recently, two new clubs have started off that appeal to a younger crowd and are much cheaper to get into, and they're called the Spoke, which is Indigenous, and the Soho, which is a branch of London Soho House. And the reason that these clubs are so popular now is that it's so difficult to get into stylish and flashy places now because they're so popular. They've become exclusive, and you have to bribe a doorman and lined up 5 deep at the bar and all that stuff. So suddenly we have this new culture, which I don't associate with Canada at all. I mean, one associates this with New York, with London. This idea of the velvet rope, the idea of exclusivity, is really new to Toronto. And of course it drives the artistic class crazy, who don't want anything to do with it. I've always followed those things, and I've always fascinated by it, and I love it. But there's an area of the city that's famously the rich shopping area called Yorkville. That's where new money goes in the city, and that's where there are coffee shops with the convertible Lotus Esprits outside, and that a lot of that money is Russian. And you go to the Four Seasons Hotel bar, where it's impossible to get a table in the lobby bar from 5 o'clock on a Friday night.
No chance.
No chance. There are Russian oligarchs who will who will get a table for lunch in the lobby bar of the Four Seasons Hotel and have lunch with a large number of people and sit at that table until cocktail hour just to keep it. And you see coming.
Drinks keep coming all the while.
Yeah, so they're fairly raucous by the end. Now, and one thinks of Toronto as the Toronto of Robertson Davies, and all the famous cliches about the conservative, what Wyndham Lewis called the sanctimonious icebox. Peter Ustinov, New York run by the Swiss, and all these things. They absolutely no longer apply. It's absolutely international. You could be in a hotel bar in Warsaw there, there's similar decadence that's going along with it. You see, some of the people who are coming in there are members of the Toronto Raptors, the sports teams. They're people with a lot of money to throw around who certainly don't have any of the stodgy WASP values that one associates with Toronto. So, I think it's changed dramatically in that regard.
So there's been a lot of importation of wealthy urban anywhere into Toronto then?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And do you think that it's made the city any less Canadian, or was it always such an international city that it didn't really matter how Canadian it was,
No, it always has been Canadian. I mean, there's by far the most popular sports team's the hockey team. I think it's very different from the rest of Canada in that way, and I'm always shocked by the ethnic homogeneity when I go to other cities in Canada. It's unusual. It's less Canadian than the rest of the country. Yeah.
Did Toronto in the beginning strike you as an especially suitable or interesting setting for fiction, or was it the place you were and thus the place in your mind as a fiction writer?
I'm from Halifax, so I always decided that I needed to get away from Halifax, the small city where I grew up, and just being a Canadian, it was going to be a Canadian city. And the choice was always Montreal, which was always seen as the sophisticated city, and Toronto. And then because the media was concentrated in Toronto, I ended up coming here to look for work. So I just ended up here by necessity. No, I never really thought about it, but I always saw it as a big city, just being a provincial, just being from a smaller town. It was always the place where we went for culture that we didn't have. I never thought in international terms just because it wasn't on my horizon. It just wasn't accessible to me.
So your friends growing up, they were all thinking it's got to be Montreal or Toronto. That was just the rule? No one's staying in Halifax?
No, not a middle-class person. No, you wouldn't. If you were of the professional class, no, you wouldn't. You would. Now, it's interesting, that changed. So in the 1980s, it was always Montreal or Toronto. And then Montreal gradually lost economic and cultural power because of the rise of separatism and the corporations fleeing there. And Vancouver grew, and Vancouver developed a film industry. And so now I think young people of my counterparts growing up now in Halifax would be thinking Toronto or Vancouver. That would be their choice. I don't think Montreal would be part of it at all.
It seems more like a lifestyle city now. I mean, Vancouver also seems like a lifestyle city. Toronto's, I say this as an outsider, but it seems to me Toronto is the most serious city here in Canada. It's the magnet.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, I mean, that's because of its economic force. Yeah. Vancouver is beautiful and delightful. I always feel that I'm in a resort town there. I mean, you see people in the summer walking down the street in bathing suits with sarongs wrapped around them. I mean, you could be in a beach town.
Many have given up their careers to go there. That's the thing.
Yeah. I mean, and the weather's delightful, and Montreal has that Gallic intensity of the sort of cigarette smoking cafe culture intensity that's still very desirable to everybody, and people dress better in Montreal for sure. And the architecture's nicer. I mean, it's just a prettier city. Toronto's spectacularly ugly. It's a sprawling 2-story 1950s crumbling brick and concrete city.
I hear people talk about the ugliness of Toronto. It doesn't seem, on the scale of world cities, it doesn't seem that ugly to me, but, do things start to look uglier to you the longer you're here?
It seems ugly on the scale of world cities to me. I mean, the urban planning is terrible. There's an urban core that has no residents in it, the financial core, and the rest of the city is low-rise sprawl. And nobody pays any attention to architecture. You don't have to get any new building approved aesthetically. So you can build, downtown in a high real estate, high density center area of the city, if you want to build a one-story McDonald's, according to the template that McDonald's gives you, you can. And it should be illegal. And certainly in Zurich, it would be illegal, you know. We just haven't ever thought that we could restrict things in that way.
Luckily, there haven't been that many one-story McDonald's down there, as far as I can tell, right?
Yeah.
The day is yet to come when they really invade.
Yeah. Well, around here, there's lots of them. Yeah.
How much Canadian literature do you regularly read that takes Canadian cities as its setting? You know, Canadian urban literature. Do you keep up with it, or have you read a lot of it?
I have, and there's more and more of it. And I mean, I don't know. I like to think I was part of the beginning of that awakening. I may be flattering myself, but I think that my first book got enough attention that I had something to do with it. Right. Certainly, other writers have younger writers have said, "God, I read you when I was, 21. You gave me hope." but now the country's so urban now that I don't think people even think about those distinctions anymore. I think that a great deal of work coming out is just naturally coming out of cities, and yeah, there are a lot of.
That's where the writers are.
That's where the writers are, and we no longer think that we have to rehash our past and our national identity. The older writers are still doing it, but no, I don't think. Yeah.
Is Toronto for you the most interesting Canadian city to read a book, be rooted in, or have there been, fascinating Montreal and Vancouver novels as well coming out recently?
There are lots of fascinating Vancouver. I mean, there's Timothy Taylor in Vancouver.
Right.
There's Rawi Haj.
He was on this show a while ago, Timothy Taylor.
Right. No, I mean, I don't care about subject matter. I like reading about Toronto, but that's a very crude critical response. It's the look, Ma, there's Dad on TV school of
familiarity. Yeah.
Familiarity, yeah.
In your column in the Globe and Mail, you do occasionally write about writing about cities. There was a book on, for example, Paris recently. You wrote about an appreciation of Paris. You have a history with Paris as well, do you not?
Yeah, I lived there as a student, and I studied French literature, most of which was set there. And I just recently went there for a holiday, and I love it. And I feel very at home there, and I go back as much as I can. Yeah, and I was interested in the writing about development and urban planning in Paris because Paris is by many people's standards the ideal city. I mean, it's just a perfectly beautiful place. So how did they do it, and what did we not do, and how could we come close to that? I also recently reviewed a book about the earliest Bohemians in London, the development of Covent Garden Market in London, and I'm fascinated by what economic conditions can arise that can let artists cohabit areas with their patrons. I mean, that's very, very rare. Altogether. I mean, certainly doesn't happen in Paris anymore. Right. Doesn't happen in New York anymore. Right. Doesn't happen in London anymore.
London's almost a caricature of that not happening now.
It's the exact opposite of that. Now we have these invisible walls around the centers of cities that artists cannot penetrate, walls of economic exclusivity. And so Toronto still is changing, but it's still one of those places where artists can actually afford to live and work downtown. Right. So and we still have all the facilities and amenities of a big city. So when I can go to a techno club and see a Berlin DJ, and stay out until 7 o'clock in the morning, I can hire my choice of 100 dominatrixes, right? So it has all that, and yet I can own property downtown. So to get those two things together is still very, very rare.
It's a rarity, and Toronto is seemingly a rarity in North American cities when I think about it, because it never had that total hollowing out of downtown, as most American cities did post-World War II.
We had no urban decay. We had no sense of the inner city. But that's because of our history. We didn't have slavery. We didn't have a migrant black population, et cetera, et cetera. But we did have industry that collapsed, and we have our Rust Belt cities outside Toronto, usually close to Toronto as well, like Detroit or Buffalo. We have our own equivalents of those, but we didn't have the social problems in the 60s and 70s that led to decaying inner cities. Yeah. So the downtown has always been the attractive place for everybody to live. It's amazing.
It came as a surprise to me when I found out that inner city didn't everywhere mean like a terrible place where you'd go to get killed, you know? And nowadays, Los Angeles more than most had that hollowed out downtown, and now it's the, coolest place to live. It's where the artists do live now, which is weird because it's full of financial towers as well. And why has it been so cheap and empty for most of its time? Now it's coming up, and the gentrification is astonishingly rapid. And yes, as I say, the hipster element is there. But tell me, this is something you've written about in columns. What do you consider a hipster to be?
Oh, well, I don't know. Who knows the answer to that? When I refer to it in columns, I'm purely talking about sartorial style. I mean, it's purely an aesthetic classification for me, because there is a very noticeable uniform that's very orthodox, usually, that we see everywhere. And when certain patterns of dress are repeated so much, there has to be a label you can give to it, the way we call the zoot suiters or the goths, I mean, sure, let's compare it to goth for a second. Sure, there are aesthetic and social values that we associate with goth. There's a style of music, there's a set of interests in the occult and that kind of thing. But what we first and foremost mean when we say goth is a look. We just picture the girl with the long black hair. So similarly with when I say hipsters, I just mean the cliche guy with the huge beard and the tattoos and the horn-rimmed glasses and the suspenders and the rolled-up jeans.
Yeah. And the brogues and no socks.
Right, and brogue, leather shoes and no socks, and the girl in the second-hand dress and the huge eyeglasses that she probably doesn't need, and the running shoes. So a certain kind of defiant claims of nonchalance, defiant anti-fashion that's clearly its own fashion. And now, yes, there are social values associated with that group, but they're much harder to put their finger on. It's not nearly as easy to do as goth, and that's where people kind of fall into a quagmire of sociology that I don't want to follow them there.
Yeah, I mean, you wrote about how it's fashionable to hate hipsters, and that itself is not. It's tempting, but it's not really productive. But I wonder, the question about why they inspire that kind of ire, I've never been quite sure why.
I know why. I mean, because obviously there's some disconnects between the pose of manliness by using these very conventional signifiers of tough manliness. I mean, the beard and the rustic clothes and the rustic aesthetic of the restaurants, the restaurants that have to have the barnyard theme, the farmyard theme, the hand press, this and that, is at odds with urban life. So, and it's at odds with another part of the hipster aesthetic, which is that the classic hipster guy is not burly. Right. He's very slim. He's quite emaciated, actually, and so that's really at odds with the axe-wielding imagery that we associate with the plaid shirt and the 1860s miner's beard, right?
The cognitive dissonance is just too much, then.
Well, so there's a dissonance then too between the beard and the carefully sculpted hair on the head, which is awfully carefully shaved on the sides and coiffed on the top. So it's like, so people are wondering, your claim of nonchalance seems to be too calculated. I think that's what bothers people. But there's also the sense, look, any flamboyant fashion is going to be mocked. I mean, I was mocked with my short hair and my skinny pants in the punk rock era. Flamboyants have been mocked since Oscar Wilde, just for looking different. And people think that there is a superiority inherent in anyone who affects a crazy uniform. This one seems particularly irritating to people, I suppose, because it seems to be a kind of claim to authenticity, which clearly doesn't exist in the media multimedia stream postmodern society. But the thing is, it's a false accusation because no hipster was actually overtly making any claim to authenticity. That's what people think they're doing, but they're not. They're putting words in their mouths. They're not I've never heard anybody actually say this is more authentic than that. Hipsters are besotted with irony, actually, usually.
I suppose so. I mean, was there so much anxiety about authenticity? Did you sense that when you first came to Toronto? People were worried about what? I feel like in that era there wouldn't have been so much.
No. I mean, that's one of the reasons I came to Toronto. See, I was in a graduate department in a small university town, where yes, then everyone was concerned with authenticity, and I felt stifled by that. And I need to get away from it. I need to get a place where people enjoyed surfaces and enjoyed the interplay of surfaces and were able to take pleasure in surfaces. Earnestness about anything is what I come to cities to avoid.
I like that. I like that way of looking at it. There's something else in this sort of, if we're talking about the population of a place. I heard you mention in an interview elsewhere that you said that this prediction in the future we'll all be writing for women. Yeah. And that you said elsewhere, other than there, in fact, that your novels sell 90% to women or something like that.
Mine, everyone's. Yeah. I mean, all fiction. I mean, the statistical gathering has not been very good on this, and most of the stuff that's been done has been in the United States. But I'm sure our numbers are the same. But they say like 80% of all fiction is bought by women. Now, I know people who work in bookstores who say nonsense. It's 90%, just judging from what I'm selling, and I know that because I go and give readings and go to book clubs, and they're all female. And see, publishers have been aware of that and gearing books to women since the 1990s.
This only applies to fiction?
Fiction, yes. I mean, men read much more nonfiction. Yeah.
Military history, men's style books. I don't know.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a problem for a kind of ardent heterosexualist like me. I mean, so I mean, I'm writing my last novel. I'm writing about a very horny guy who's very visually attuned and objectifies women.
And gets worse as he goes.
Yeah, I mean, and so writing that for an audience that's all women is going to be off-putting for them. I mean, it's interesting though. It
seems like that wasn't off-putting for them in this book.
It wasn't. Some of the best reviews I had were from women, and in fact, I worked for a long time as a restaurant critic for the free weekly, alternative weekly magazine here called Now Magazine, which is a very left-wing magazine. My editor there was an old-school, second-wave feminist. And she, after I left there, it was her job to review some of my novels. She didn't like any of them. And this one, Girl Crazy...
I wonder how objective she could be in that situation.
Well, Girl Crazy, she loved. And this is the book I thought she would hate the most because it's a man obsessed with women's bodies and what they look like. And she saw it really as a critique of male sexuality, an indictment of its failings, of its insecurities.
And if you want to see that, you can see it.
I was thrilled. I mean, and I'm happy for a good review.
It's a fine line between accurate description and satire, right?
Well, exactly. And so in that way, I think a lot of women enjoyed seeing what is it like to be inside a sexually besotted man's mind. I'm going to learn from that. I'm going to learn about how strangely weak that makes men, and that's how she saw it, and I'm happy with that.
It reminds me of a story I heard on the radio show This American Life. It was about a woman becoming a man, undergoing a sex change, and she got the hormones first and found that whereas if she was attracted to someone before on the train or whatever, she would look at them and wonder, I wonder what they're like. I wonder what it would be like if I talked to them. I wonder what their personality is. She got the hormones and then got, a porno movie playing in her head, what she thought was a porno movie in her head as soon as she saw someone she was attracted to. And it's interesting. I've talked about that with a lot of people, and it seems like we can conceive of this as just a difference in directionality. A woman starts with personality, goes to sexual attraction. A man starts with sexual attraction, goes to personality. I mean, it's just an inverse, right?
Yeah, I would agree, yeah.
If you look at it in a certain way, if you're a woman likely to look at a man and say, what a pig, he's evaluating women sexually. It's like that's that's step one toward going to the point where you start. You know, there's not really a value judgment to be made there. Ultimately, it's just mirror image.
Yeah. I agree with you.
Is that a dynamic you've thought about when writing fiction? Is that a way you've framed it to yourself with male and female characters?
I teach fiction as well, and I teach writers to never ever catch yourself. To always catch yourself if you start thinking about the reader. It's death. It's absolute death to start worrying what kind of reader is going to be reading this and how can I please or appeal to that reader.
So you don't think of the vast field of women waiting for the book.
I mean, I would have to stop writing, right? The only reader you're writing for, and all fiction writers are writing for, is what you have in your head as the ideal, the maximal reader, the optimal reader who's going to get every joke and understand every reference, and that can only be yourself. I mean, you're only writing then the kind of book that you yourself would read. And that's all I want to write. And so I have to block out any thought of how a suburban Canadian female over 45 readership, which is my readership, is going to react to that. It would just block me completely. And then you finish writing, and it comes out, and you think, oh my God, I cannot believe I'm putting this out to the public eye. They're going to hate this, because you have to be in that totally private, uncensored space in order to get any honesty out there at all.
I wonder, you talk about writing for yourself. As a reader, what sort of Toronto stories do you want to hear told? What are the books you want to read that are from Toronto?
Oh, that's a great question, and they're not being written. I mean, there's so much exciting life here and exciting stories, and people continue to be writing very limited stories about the educated middle class. Look, the whole world has been following our mayoral drama recently. We have had a crack cocaine an alcoholic mayor with criminal connections who was completely incompetent and unable to run the fourth largest city in North America, and still many of the novelists writing here are writing about their childhood in Northern Ontario. Now, if we had kind of American-style screenwriters here, we'd be getting miniseries about these all the time. I don't know why we don't have a tradition to do that. Years ago,
nobody would believe Rob Ford if he was fictional. That's the thing.
No, definitely. But we don't have our political satire dramas like House of Cards about these situations. And when I was hanging around on College Street in the 1990s. There was a strange small-scale war going on around there. There was a restaurant, an Italian restaurant that was quite flashy. I was hanging in one restaurant, and this was about 3 doors down. And it was the flashy women you might see in Yorkville. They had fur coats, they had short dresses, and they had blonde hair. And guys in long leather coats were going there. Young guys, big guys. And I always wondered what is going on in there. It wasn't my kind of university scene, but I was fascinated with it because it was flashy and sexy and glamorous. Well, one day, my restaurant is closed because it's been firebombed. Nobody will explain what's going on. Then a few weeks later, the front window of that other restaurant is shattered and people say, oh, there's a bomb. Then the owner of the restaurant is shot in broad daylight by an angry guy who runs in with a gun and he shoots him. It turns out there was a story that was just a story about a woman. Actually, it was a love triangle thing.
Yeah, of course.
No, but fantastic. I mean, this is a few blocks from the University of Toronto. We're all living in the middle of this. Who is going to write these stories? And partly it's just the problem that fiction is increasingly university linked because of our MFA programs. And I'm guilty of this. I teach it in an MFA program. But there are fiction is written by middle-class people living in middle-class circles. And they're not going out the way Saul Bellow would have done and working in a stockyard, so we just don't have access to those stories, and it's sad. It's about really if one could interpret it in purely economic terms. It's about the widening gap between rich and poor, I think, that widen class differences. So there's a kind of person who ends up writing a novel and a kind of person who ends up knowing the guys who are shooting each other in restaurants. And it's really too bad.
The twain do not meet.
The twain do not meet.
And as far as your own subject matter goes, I said Blindsided, it has the subtitle, which it has the subtitle how 20 years of writing about sex, booze, and drugs came to an end in the blink of an eye. Has that really come to an end? Are you done with writing about those things?
I may be done with writing about them, but I'm certainly not done with going out. I go out a lot less than I used to. But I'm still fascinated by nightlife, and now I'm going to more expensive places. I'm just older, so I'm not. Oh, who am I kidding? I've always gone to expensive places, but but I'm going less. I'm still fascinated by the aesthetics of them. This Friday, tomorrow, is my wife's birthday, and we met in a time of decadence in both of our lives, and we are going to go to the one Toronto techno club and going to see Dubfire, who is visiting, and we are going to stay out till 7 a.m. And we have, my sister-in-law is going to stay the night and wake up with our child and give him breakfast, and we're going to go to a hotel. It's still possible to do that. I savor it a lot more, and it takes me months to recover, but and I'm
still do it.
and I can still do it, and it's still really, really important to the life of this city, and I hope that even though I'm not going to be able to cover it so much more, I really hope that there is a new generation of writers who's going to be interested in that kind of drama and that kind of glamour. And I'm troubled that there is a generation of university-educated writers, and I know because I teach them, who have grown up with gender and privilege studies, who are very conscious of the problem of privilege, who are nervous about privilege, who are very nervous about money generally, nervous about exclusivity, and would all reject the possibilities of drama given by the kind of place that I've always been fascinated with, were wealthy nightclubs and bars and exclusive things. And they are ignoring them completely, and they're not conscious that 19th century novelists didn't ignore them. Anna Karenina is about extremely privileged people.
The inner circle.
Vanity Fair, is about extremely privileged people. And my idols, Evelyn Waugh in particular, it's about the fast set. The Great Gatsby is about the fast set. And it's fascinating. You look at the reviews of The Great Gatsby on Goodreads, 50% of them hate The Great Gatsby, saying, and the reason is they say, I don't care about privileged people. I do not want to know the lives of these horrible privileged people who don't deserve our interest. So,
those aren't people.
Right. So there's a generation of democratic education with the very best of intent has turned people off to so many possibilities of glamour. And drama that comes from glamour. I find it kind of sad. I want to tell writers, get over your prim politics. Get over your prim politics, and you will find a lot more drama comes your way.
Right. It's true, and I've been speaking here in Toronto, a city with plenty of drama left in it, with Russell Smith. He's the author of novels, most recently Girl Crazy. He's got an ebook out more recently called Blindsided, as we've discussed, and he's the author of a style and culture column in the Globe and Mail. His book, by the way, is Men's Style. That's also out. Russell, thanks so much.
Thanks a lot. It's been a pleasure.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. Special thanks to everyone who backed Season 4 on Kickstarter, including Joel Neville Anderson, Daniel Levin Becker, Paige Calvert, Commander Manvark, Jonathan Crow, John Cunningham, David Dawes, James DeVito, Tim Dobbs, Paul Doyle, Jake Elliott, Kevin Emmett, Lawrence English, Jonathan Filbert, Andrew Philippone Jr., Michael Fransky, John French, Themistocles Eucrucius, Will Graham, Umberto Grant, Samuel Hansen, David Hayes, Jeff Hillenbrand, Mark Hines, Andrew Johnstone, Tadeusz Andrzej Kadlubowski, Peter Kavanagh, Ted Kane, Andy Cooney, Evan Landman, Alfred Lee, James Maloney, Sean McDonald, Alberto Bruzos Moro, Jason Miller, Rob Montz, Daniel Murphy, Richard Nash, Aidan Nullman, Patrick O'Flaherty, Danny Olson, Michael O'Regan, Ian Blosker, Christopher Porter, MJ Pritchett, Piers Rippey, Rob Schultz, Todd Shimoda, Cam Smith, Deborah Smith, Adam Sutherland, Maureen Kincaid Speller, Anna Traher, Thomas Unterberger, Matt Warren, Nick Weigelt, John Wolfe, Cynthia Yang, and Wayne Wright.